Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the fourth episode of The Future of Architecture. It's me, Akil, the host, talking today to Niall Patrick Walsh. And Niall, in his esteemed career, highly accoladed career, I think the justice will best be done when he gives a little intro onto himself. So Niall, welcome to The Future of Architecture. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself. Not that you need any introduction, but please go for it.
I'll try anyway. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Akil, for inviting me. It's a pretty cool series you're doing so far. So my name's Niall Patrick Walsh. I'm based in Dublin, Ireland, and I full-time I'm an architectural designer. I graduated from my master's in architecture just under 2 years ago, so very much at the beginning of my career. I think, Akil, we're both. Are we still both the same age? 26?
Yes, we're still both the same age.
Cool. Someday it might be different. That was a kind of a stupid question, but so full-time since graduating, I work with the BDP Building Design Partnership. They're one of the largest design and engineering firms in Europe. I think we've about 1,000 employees worldwide, something like 16 offices in 9 countries. So that's what I occupy myself with 9 to 5. And apart from that, I have a whole writing side to my career. So for 2 years, mostly kind of when I was in university, I was a senior editor at ArchDaily, which is the world's most visited architecture website. And I left there about 8 months ago to kind of explore some of my own ideas. So since that, I've started a platform called Bubble Futures Platform, which kind of expands on the idea that architecture goes beyond the responding to the everyday brief and responding to the kind of confines of, say, the property market or real estate market, and that the skills that we acquire in university and beyond, and any sort of college or any time in our career, can have applications beyond that. So we look at a lot of global issues, try and collect. We publish our own ideas and also try and collect ideas from our community. And my writing as well, I also work with architects quite a lot to help them explain their own ideas through text. So whether that's helping them with project descriptions, press releases, etc., rewriting their websites, and also working with, say, academics at the moment on we're publishing a book about the future of education, how to examine architecture, which I don't think we've spoken about before. I probably should have brought that up since you're in education.
Let's go for it.
We'll do that. Yes. So that's kind of a summation of what I do. And in my free time, I also enter some competitions.
You have free time now? Sure. Based on all of that, you still have some free time.
So I enter competitions, etc., and try to collaborate with people where I can, and in general try to promote the connection between architecture and the broader world, and the skills. Try to encourage architects, designers, students, graduates to kind of push boundaries in what their careers could look like in the future. So I think that's maybe a summation of what I do day to day. Michiel?
Now, honestly, I think I'm almost scared to see what your calendar for a day looks like. It sounds so packed, and I don't know how you are doing so much, but thank you for the work you do, because I think you are part of a very important movement and a very important paradigm shift in architecture. So you did mention a little bit about going off on your own. So far, you've been investing a lot of time in Bubble's platform as well as into writing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because you just briefly mentioned it. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it is that you are doing on Bubble's platform?
Bubble Futures platform,
Bubble
sure.
Futures,
well,
yes.
I mean, so what I actually do at the moment, just so I'm not talking into a wall, I'll share my screen and show the website.
Great.
So let me know when you can see it in a second.
I can see it now.
Okay, cool. So I'll just this is basically a very quick overview of one of the things I'm doing at the moment. So Bubble Futures platform, a lot of what we try to do is identify issues around the world. So for example, loneliness or isolation. And we challenge designers, usually through ideas competitions, to come up with solutions as to how architects can tackle the issues of loneliness, isolation, etc. So we try to encourage people to think beyond the box, think outside the normal constraints of everyday architecture, to come up with solutions which kind of promote the role that we as designers can play the evolution of humankind and the evolution of cities, and the evolution of the kind of flows that make up the modern world, whether that's food, water, data, energy, ideas, or people. So that is kind of an overview of that. So as for kind of what that means, or why do I do it, which I think was probably the question, I don't tend to kind of sit down and think what would be a cool thing for me to start. This is already, I think, a journey that I just undertake for myself about trying to understand my role in the profession and my role in the world. And I've always felt that as architects, you know, we sit at such an interesting junction of technology, of culture, of buildings, and of the kind of spatial environment, that we have a lot more to offer the world than what we traditionally do in our everyday life. So anything I do, whether that's Bubble Futures platform, or even to a certain extent in my writing, but particularly in the competitions that I enter, is all just trying for me to kind of further my own understanding of what areas are not off limits for architects to explore, and what our contribution could be, and how can my career evolve to be more than responding to the day-to-day needs of, say, a property developer, or a house builder, or even in an institution looking to construct a new building for new use, which isn't to degrade or to dismiss that role of architects, because that is essential role of architects. I just think that it's for me, for my kind of background and my interest in the world, has not been enough to kind of satisfy, and it hasn't been enough to satisfy all the time I put into education, into understanding different issues, different industries, and different elements that just go far beyond the design of a building. So that's kind of the attitude I take to my everyday stuff. And even with ArchDaily, it was particularly in the kind of latter articles I wrote, as I kind of grew more comfortable in that position. A lot of the articles I wrote were geared towards that, about understanding the role of architects in food production, the effects of urbanization on rural landscapes, whether that's through mining and excavations, or whether that's through how cities evolved in response to policy such as accessibility, or social housing or transport. And what I always found kind of interesting was that if I wrote an article which went far beyond the day-to-day workings of an architect, those were quite often the most popular articles, which I also always kind of found that interesting, that there's quite a large amount of people who consume architectural media every day who themselves exhibit, and these are people at all stages of their profession, who still maintain an active interest in the world around them, and it just often doesn't tend to translate to the everyday work, the everyday responsibilities of an architect in the property or the real estate market. So anything I do is trying to kind of push that boundary.
So now I think that what you've mentioned is very important. This you could almost call it some sort of multidisciplinary approach that you have, because it does, architecture does sit at the intersection of many of these things, and your attitude towards it is one that architects are in dire need of. I think it is an attitude we all need to adopt, so that it's not only that we can see the actual significance of architecture, but we can also broaden our relevance. Actually, in previous discussions, you mentioned, and even now, you sort of touched on the topic of global flows and the invisible organizational structure, which has created wasted spaces. And I know this is something that had also been investigated on the competitions that you've hosted. So can you share some more insight, especially in light of the urban regeneration, the pandemic and adaptive reuse? Could you share a little bit insight on it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the probably a good idea for me to probably share the competition, actually.
Oh, that would be great.
Let's see here. Yeah, what I'll do is just kind of keep this open as I talk. Yeah, so the whole question of wasted spaces in cities, I think, is kind of an interesting one. It's quite a, I mean, it's only one, I think, small element of what I find interesting in my day to day, but it is an example of art, the kind of invisible flows manifesting in real space. Quite often, the wasted spaces we see in cities, whether that's kind of between buildings, or whether that's spaces which have been kind of created by the carving up of landscape to create transport infrastructures or waste infrastructures, etc., or water infrastructures. Those zones are quite often shaped by policy, or they're created by unique needs, which are quite often invisible, but nonetheless necessary for the kind of everyday functioning of a city. I mean, if you want some crazy examples of it, I think it's in Tokyo, where there's effectively a second city underneath Tokyo, in terms of the size of it, which is just purely dedicated to absorbing water in flooding. There's all these kind of spaces for different needs and different infrastructures which just exist in cities. And it's almost as if it's almost like the analogy of the internet, where something like only 2% of the internet is available to everyday users, and there's a whole like 98%, which some people call the dark web, but it's not all nefarious like that. It's quite a large portion of that is servers of private companies, say Google or Facebook or whatever, and the kind of intranet of private servers. So it's you look at when you look at the internet, you're only seeing a very, very small part of the online world. And I think cities are very similar. When you look at the cities today, the proportion of a city that is used by everyday people is relatively small compared to the actual landmass of that city. And so the competition that I entered was an example. I think it was in China, a city called Kunming. And the challenge was to take one of these wasted spaces, which was an evacuation tunnel that ran under a series of apartment and shopping center buildings in China, and try to reimagine that in a more public, open way, but which could also fulfill its function as an evacuation tunnel. And so I kind of intersected that idea of kind of wasted space with the question of how can we turn these wasted spaces into spaces of production.
Right.
And I think quite a lot of other people might look at such a space and say, how do we create a kind of museum or place of artifact, or a place or a place of showcase? And
that's actually the first architectural intervention students or architects go for. Make a museum, make some place of exhibition. But sorry, now before you carry on, I just must mention you had a very good analogy, like the internet and the city. That's a very strong analogy. I just wanted to point it out because I think it's very important for us to notice such analogies. But yes, please continue.
Yeah, sure. So I, rather than taking that kind of idea of, because I think it goes to the heart of my just view of architecture, that I don't think architecture should be artifact. I think architecture should be function. It should be production, and it should be active. I mean, I don't think I wrote it in this particular competition, but I came up with it later. The idea of rather than living in the city, it's almost like living with the city.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah,
language usage is very good.
I'm a writer, but I kind of intersected the brief here with an interest that I'd had from my thesis, which was about food and farming. And I just intersected this. Okay, you have this wasted space in the city. What are some of the industries which would be of a benefit to us to see more of in everyday life?
And you actually won this competition, didn't you? Now.
Yeah. This was a first place somehow.
First place.
But
something I know that's pretty big. So this was a space you reimagined, right? And you say that there's production brought to it. Can you tell me about the production? I know you're getting to it, but this production, sure. I can see it quite vividly in the image. Would you be able to just zoom in a bit more so we could see the perspective that's there? Is it possible?
Probably here you can see it a bit better.
Yes, I can.
So the central premise behind this was to, so you take the actual tunnel itself. My idea was to create basically a tunnel within a tunnel, which would integrate all the necessary infrastructures and technologies and flows.
So this tunnel was under the city, and it's abandoned. Yes. It's abandoned.
It's used as an evacuation tunnel.
Oh,
so
that's
it's
what you're
not
saying,
used.
evacuation.
It's not used day to day.
Okay.
It's almost like a fire escape tunnel.
Okay, so it's only fire escape for, of course, when it's necessary. So that's
Yes,
when it
yeah.
becomes activated. But you are adding to that program now.
Yeah, so the brief, my idea was to create a space which could still be used as an evacuation tunnel. I think you can see it
Oh,
here.
all right, all
So
right,
it's the creation of a tunnel, almost like a tunnel within a tunnel,
right.
but it's overlaying this with creating a landscape which is not only desirable to be in, but actually has a function. So
Okay.
I did a lot of digging into, the future of food production. What new ways are we discovering of growing food? And I came across all these experiments which have been run mostly in universities, but also in food technology centers, etc. Of how things like not just urban farming, but like upside down farming, vertical farming, all of these things which can contribute to faster yields, which can contribute to healthier crops, and also the fact that the sheer rate at which we're able to grow food now is accelerating, mostly due to the intervention of science into food.
Ah,
And
so you married food technology and architecture in this particular
yeah, I guess
project.
I guess you could call it food production.
Food production. Okay.
Food production with food education, maybe,
Okay.
is the way
Oh,
you could
okay.
put it.
True.
And with the idea that by reactivating this wasted space, not just as an area for food production, it would also be a place where people could come and see this production happen in real life. And it speaks to this broader narrative of trying to merge our everyday life with the systems and the infrastructures which sustain that life. One of the single largest problem we have today with food production, for example, is how divorced we are from the food which we eat on a daily basis, and that goes a long way to not only the unsustainable, ecologically disastrous, also morally questionable food growth techniques that we have, but also the sheer volume of food that we waste. I think it's something like 50% of food in America is thrown away.
That's crazy.
Yeah, because we're divorced from where it comes from. And you might say, well, what's the problem with us being divorced with where food comes from? It's the
well, that is a question generally people ask.
yeah. Well, it's kind of, there's several layers to it. Firstly, we have to understand that food production is one of the most environmentally damaging systems that we know of. The sheer volume. I mean, I think it's every year a size of I think it's a size of, is it 10% of the Amazon rainforest, an area equivalent, which is destroyed for food production. But then
Don't
also
worry,
in that
we'll
same,
check.
in that,
We'll provide links to that fact. So don't worry, you just go for it.
but so yeah, and then but every year we destroy that exact equivalent of land in through unsustainable farming techniques.
I see.
And then tied to that, food poverty, where vast amounts of the food that we eat go to certain nations more than others, dependent on how strong their trade links are with other countries.
Right.
But then also when we think about food, when we expand and when we remove ourselves from the everyday growth of food or transport of food, what we've actually created is this incredibly fragile and precarious network of the trade network. I think I actually have yeah. So this is part of my university analysis, where I looked at simply the food which is exported or imported from Northern Ireland, because I studied in Belfast, Northern Ireland.
Okay.
And something like 95% of the food which you buy in Northern Ireland is imported from this long list of countries. Then you might say, well, what's the problem with that? Look, take out all the take out the environmental consequences of transport, etc. What I actually found was that 95% of this food passes through what are called global choke points, and these are highly precarious and dangerous and unstable parts of the world, such as the Straits of Hormuz, which is basically runs a needle through Iran and I think Saudi Arabia. Or you have the Dover Strait, which is constantly being congested with over issues over Brexit and about rights of travel, or U.S. Gulf ports, which are constantly being hit by hurricanes. and the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, which are often the center of political tension. A huge amount of our food passes through these very, very precarious parts of the world as a direct consequence of the systems which which have grown over time.
Oh, I
And
understand.
and every so often we see the consequences of this. I mean, Brexit was one example of how Ireland and Northern Ireland continue to suffer from food shortages because of the over-reliance on food traveling through the Dover Strait, traveling from what is now the European Union into the United Kingdom.
Oh.
When you depend on these choke points for food, and when you divorce cities from food production and from the industries which are necessary to sustain that city, you create an extremely precarious and ultimately unsustainable and an unaccountable system. So
That was
that
something
was
I
kind
was
of,
as unaware of. So now you are informing me of that, which I did not know.
yeah, sure. I mean, what I might actually do, I don't mind sharing this entire, because there's a lot of, yeah, here we go. 19 million hectares destroyed annually to create
Ah,
farmland. 90 million hectares destroyed
that that's quite hectic.
due to unsustainable methods. I'm happy to just share this whole presentation with you afterwards. Maybe you can
Sure,
distribute it.
that'll be great.
So part of my interest was simply, okay, how can you firstly start to localize these systems so
Okay.
that cities are can be ultimately more food secure by having more control over the food they consume, with the added benefit of merging our understanding and of enhancing our understanding of the food process by experiencing it in our everyday life, but then also this idea of living with the city, actually giving purpose to city centres, which are increasingly being carved out by the decline of retail, now the decline of offices,
Yeah.
and asking how to, and ironically, I think Elon Musk actually said this, he said we need cities to start making things again rather than just selling them. And so this is very much just one vision for the future of urbanism, one where the means of production in cities are activated by these means of productions. And it does place responsibility on architects and designers to start to engage more with these systems, start to understand some of the failings of how cities are sustained. I think in 2017, the City of London, the kind of Mayor of London's office, did a study to try and understand how sustainable is London, how if you take in all the materials, the food, water, energy, waste, everything, what area of land do you need to sustain London? What they found is that London at the present time, London needs an area of land 237 times the size of London to sustain
Oh,
itself. Such as the extent to which we have outsourced the everyday infrastructures and the everyday processes which we need to sustain a city. So I think as
yeah.
architects, we need to start asking questions about how, on the one hand, you have cities which are generating an ever increasing amount of wasted space, and yet these very same cities are creating new landscapes, often in rural areas or in kind of suburban areas, which are required to sustain those cities. It's almost as if we're outsourcing space of cities.
That's true. That's actually quite an interesting thought, because we have so much of space or it seems as though we have a lot of space in cities which is unused, but yet we continue to occupy it outside of the actual urban surroundings itself. That's
Yeah,
something that
and it intersects with our ability to start to populate urban centers with production is maybe for decades was not feasible due to the sheer volumes of land and maybe the inefficiencies of the processes we needed. But I mean, food is just one example of how our understanding of how to grow food, how to produce food, new methods of producing, say, meat, which doesn't require such vast amounts of land to be given over to animals. How it increases in technology and developments in technology are allowing us to integrate systems more with cities. They're becoming more, to put it blunt, or to put it rather simply, we were requiring much less land to create much more things. if that makes sense.
Oh, okay. So would you do you think there is a lot of space in the cities that could be occupied, and like you're saying, because we require less space, do you think the so-called wasted spaces in the city are sufficient to sustain it? Or in your opinion, do you think we're reaching this goal in future?
I don't think you're ever going to be 100%.
Okay.
I don't think cities will ever be 100% sustainable. I think we've gone too far past the mark.
Okay.
We've gone maybe too far down the road of globalization for cities to be totally self-sufficient. It shouldn't mean that we shouldn't try and make them as sufficient as possible. And it's not, you know, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not one or the other. But I think that wasted spaces in cities are only set to increase, and they're going to increase due to simply to advances in the way we live. I mean, transport is one good example. Less and less people are owning cars. More and more people are depending on public transport systems or are ride sharing or using things like Uber. So that just begs a very, very simple question. What about car parks in city centres?
True.
Massive, and I mean, Ireland and the UK particularly are countries which are very car dependent, and parts of America are very car dependent. Where massive amounts of land in city centres are given up to car parks. I think Berlin is another example as well. That by itself, just simply by freeing up that space, you have these large plots of land. Some of that can be used for, is that best used for living in cities, for building more housing, or other infrastructures we can implement, where cities can start to reclaim back some of the processes that they need to sustain themselves. That's not just food, that's energy, that's water, that's material goods. Can we start to roll back on that system that I showed?
Yeah.
Can we start to roll back some of this? I mean, you mentioned the pandemic. It took a pandemic for us to realize that most countries don't make their own medicine. We're in a situation now, particularly with vaccines, where there's a very real concern that poorer countries who don't have the means of production for their own medical supplies are going to be left behind in the administration of a vaccine. I mean, take masks, for example. There were huge mask shortages at the beginning of this pandemic in America. I mean, you had the CDC try to downplay the effectiveness of masks simply because medical personnel were struggling to acquire enough for operations, etc. A lot of this was because America had outsourced a lot of its masks making to China and to Asia, and as a result of this, they had no control over their own supplies. So it takes disasters such as this for us to realize that globalization is a good thing. It allows us to travel more effectively. It allows us to learn from other countries. But at a certain point, we have to stand back and think, are we sacrificing on urban security and food security, material security by divorcing cities from the very goods that they need to sustain themselves? And as our use of cities expands and as it changes, are there opportunities to start to integrate some of these systems back? And I think there are. And yeah, I think architects have a role to play in that.
I think you actually raise extremely interesting and also extremely valid points. So you can say valid or invalid, but extremely valid seems to be a strange term. But those are points which you and I have previously discussed about the effects of the pandemic on people traveling and creating now, you could almost call it abandoned spaces in the city, because if people work from home and they realize you can continue to work from home, then office space, as you mentioned earlier, would be less occupied. So are you suggesting that what we do in these spaces is perhaps retrofitted to some degree, or like the car parks, create installations that produce so that we can, as you say, live with the city instead of the alternative?
Well, I think that as architects, we need to get better at writing briefs rather than just fulfilling them. I think we need to get better at examining particular sites and thinking, what are some of the, my particular master's, I was lucky, we did focus a lot on this, about looking at what are some of the uses that could be enacted on this site. because there's not a one size fits all solution. We can't just say every single car park in every single city we're going to put a farm on it, or we're going to put housing on it. It will require architects to seek out opportunities and try to, so in my competition is one example. Urban farming is only one solution to that. There's probably a million solutions to that, all of which are valid. So I think that I think that we need to slightly broaden our own broaden our minds and start to use some of these skills we've acquired in examining not just physical environments but cultural environments, energy environments, climate environments, and start to develop a louder voice in advocating for better land use in cities, rather than and spotting new opportunities, how new uses could come to cities, whether that's food or energy, or it could be new modes of housing. And so I think more focus on briefs, I think, would be good for us.
Sorry, continue now.
No, go on, sorry.
No, so I was just going to say, you had a particularly interesting graphic about how you've applied this ideology of almost reinventing a site. It's the block side by side, which showed how you created a tunnel in a tunnel. Will you be able to just bring that image back up again? Yes. Can you talk us through this, because this is, if you could say, the architectural realization of the ideas you've just discussed.
Sure. Well, the goal, I think, for these particular diagrams, the goal was to make the process seem as feasible or as simple as possible. The thought here was that you have this kind of quite large. You can see the scale of a human here. That you can actually create these quite flexible new infrastructures. I call it the kind of tunnel within a tunnel, whereby these can be robotically created or made by humans. I think my proposal was for these to be 3D printed kind of hexagonal structures, but that you can, by kind of overlaying a new use, and you can create a single environment which achieves several different functions. So you can see here, maybe this is one of the best examples, where you have looking downwards, you've literal food production and food exploration. Above that, you have kind of a new infrastructural system which can transport. I have this is probably too low resolution to zoom in on, but try to understanding kind of circularity in the food process, where things such as aquaponic systems, where the connection between animal waste or fish waste from fish can feed into growth of fruit and vegetables, and then also transporting water and waste and all other sorts of energy systems, that these can be again overlaid into existing structures. And then also there's the added benefit of people. You can actually overlay another layer, which is that of education and that of more spatial public experience, where, as well as kind of seeing the means of production around you, you also have technologies, whether that's screens or displays, which can help to educate and help people to understand more about what is actually occurring around them. So this is one vision for how architecture can kind of intersect with education, with production, with material flows.
You were actually, so just this project in itself is an educational experience about showing us how food systems can be used in such a way that we become aware of them and actually bear fruit, and literally and metaphorically. So is the system that you propose, how much of energy does it consume, and how much is it generating of its own accord?
Sure. The calculation I did was the length of this tunnel. It aligned almost perfectly to the waste systems and the offset energy systems from the, I think it was 300 apartments, which were above it. It was 300 apartments plus the shopping center. A lot of the waste heat and the kind of waste electricity, which could be taken from those apartment systems, almost aligned perfectly with, I think it was a 160 meter long tunnel, which could be fed into keeping water at optimal conditions for fish, that the actual waste products of the food itself, or sorry, the waste products of the fish itself could be transformed into nitrates, which we fed into the soil. So by placing these systems close to people, you can start to create these kind of energy loops and kind of feedback loops between food, between people, and commerce, etc. I mean, it was kind of the same thinking behind data. I mean, and there's a growing understanding now of the advantages of placing data servers in close proximity to people. I mean, you can search. I mean, some of the Microsoft and Amazon and other companies who are placing data centers in cities and then using excess heat for greenhouses, for heating homes and heating entire towns. So it's kind of the same idea. It's where when you start to integrate these systems with urban environments, you can start to create these kind of feedback loops and energy loops and waste loops, to create a kind of a more circular system and more of a dialogue between how we live and the actual processes that we depend on. And I think, I mean, just to bring this back to architecture and to bring this back to architects, I think we probably are one of the only professions which could engage with both sides of that kind of dichotomy of spaces for people versus spaces for systems. And I think that it's one viable future for the profession is to try and understand how we can more closely align the needs of people spatially with the material needs, with the energy needs and the food needs of say growing populations in cities. So I think that's I think it's kind of an underlying element of everything I do, is to try and understand how we can position ourselves more along that stream of understanding the world around us, and to therefore maybe broaden our own brief and broaden our own role in shaping, literally shaping the future of living.
That's quite true. Literally shaping the future. You, in our previous discussions on the same idea, you mentioned the hungry city, and talking again about those ideas of food production being far removed from the consumer.
Sure.
At a certain stage in time, there were benefits and there were disadvantages. Oh, there's the book there. There's one prominent mindset that we've seen, which you've discussed now, that we're so divorced from the idea of food production that we are oblivious to the sources of food. So what do you think is a sensible solution to this without being on either end of the spectrum? Just particularly looking at our mindset, because I think your project is a very good embodiment of these ideas. But when it comes to a mindset and an attitude, what do you think is a sensible attitude to have?
Well, I mean, I think it all comes back to space. It all comes back to our spatial experiences. We respond to things a lot more actively when they're in front of us, to whether we read about it. I think Mark Zuckerberg said once about how he was making this point. I'm not sure why it was him making this point, but he said that we, as humans, we respond more emotionally to an injured dog outside our house than we respond emotionally to the plight of actual humans in other parts of the world that we don't experience in the everyday.
Very, very true. Yeah.
And it goes back, and it all kind of centers on our experience of the everyday. It's kind of hard for us to ignore our surrounding physical environment. It's why we seek out cities. It's why we move on from cities. It's when our physical environments change, we respond either positively or negatively to it. I mean, on the topic of food, I mean, there's been examples. I mean, I think we talked about this quite a bit in the early 1900s in Chicago. Before kind of one stage in factory farming was food production was located closer to cities, and particularly in America in the early 1900s, quite a lot of the meat industry. I mean, you still hear references to, say, the meat packing industry in New York, or the meat packing district in New York. A lot of these processes did used to occur in cities, and in the early 1900s in Chicago, there was an expose by an author, Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle, which was all about the conditions of the meatpacking industry in Chicago, and the kind of he actually, his book was about actually the exploitation of workers who worked in these conditions. And everybody read the book and didn't care about the workers. They were actually concerned about the animals. They were about the treatment of the animals. But nonetheless, it led to massive swathes of protest of the conditions and the systems which had been created to satisfy our food needs, and it led to a massive public backlash, and for a time could have spelled the end of the factory of factory farming. There was a huge decline in the sale of meat, simply because of people's unease at the systems which were being propagated in order to sustain it. That was really only possible because people were aware of it, that it was happening on their doorstep. When you outsource this to other parts of the world, it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind mentality. But the response of the meat industry while I'm here was actually quite interesting. Rather than changing anything about the system, they simply removed this system from the cities out to, whether it was to different countries or different environments, and instead they tried to redefine our experience of meat. And I think this food chain still exists, White Castle in America, but it was the first. It was kind of the first advent of creating an architecture which was of food, but basically hid the realities of the food system itself. And rather than this quite gory, crowded, packed, probably disease-ridden reality of food, which was the previous architecture of food, it was replaced by this very kind of cleanly, human-orientated, almost totally divorced, an architecture totally divorced from the reality of the system that it was dependent on. And this is what effectively led to the kind of generic fast food movement, and even still today.
That's quite an interesting analogy that you or actually connection you've made there. So this hidden architecture is almost like it disguises our understanding of what fast food actually is and the realities of it.
It's a tool of branding. Architecture is part of a branding exercise in trying to hide the reality of where food comes from. I mean, there's a famous was it? Thomas Jefferson said there's two things there's two things that people should never be shown: how to make taxes and how to make sausages. I think it's like, because they're two quite gory, kind of immoral, unsustainable systems. But so this was just one. It was one moment where there was an intersection between cities and urbanism, and you can see here how architecture. I think the whole point of I gave this lecture last year. The whole point was to show that architecture is not divorced from this. Architecture can be a tool of these kind of systems for the good or for the worse. Even if you take the most mundane view of architecture, a simple structure like this, at the end of the day, you can't really escape what it represents, and you can't escape. It can't divorce itself from the uses and the systems and the infrastructures and the thought processes and the purposes which a building as simple as this represents. So it's why I've always advocated that as architects we need to be more aware of the not just the physical environment that we design in, say, in the stereotypical kind of sun path diagrams that we always see, but to go further and think about the connection of a site to technology, to health, to energy, to food, water, to waste, and even to ideas. It's all almost everything that occurs in the modern world somehow manifests as architecture. There's always going to be an architecture to everything. Even if you take a digital world, there will always be an architecture of that. It will always manifest in physical space, quite often through data centers, etc. There will, and even to someone entering a digital environment or a virtual environment, they're always going to have a position in a physical environment. So as architects, we can't really ignore that. And I think it's one future for the profession, is to try and understand more about how architecture and how the built environment intersects with all these different uses and functions.
That's an excellent way to mention it. How does it intersect? Because this intersection would necessitate a new attitude towards it, and I think it's an attitude strongly based on the idea of responsibility, of us becoming responsible for the effects of the things we create. It is an attitude of accountability, responsibility, even of prudence, looking towards the future. So talking about these attitudes and this divorce that has perhaps led to alternative views on these attitudes, or actually alternative attitudes. You mentioned in your widely recognized article, just as you said earlier, that the articles that talk about things or about architecture in its greater position and context, the article you've written, How the Dutch Use Architecture to Feed the World. You mentioned that architecture can be a vehicle for not only responsible and efficient farming, but you also alluded to the great potential that architecture has to increase economic viability through architecture. Now, I know this is perhaps one of the outcomes of your article, because you had a different agenda when writing it, but could you maybe elaborate on how you feel about this path of economic viability, and maybe creating a sub-discipline in architecture, perhaps you can call it an agritecture in some respect. And just tell us more about where you were going with the article, and quite interesting to see how different ideas have emerged from it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this article came from really the motivation was the photography, which was sent to me by a photographer called Tom Hagen, who does an extremely good job of documenting these kind of processes, whether it's food or mining or excavation or anything. And it was based off an article from National Geographic, I think 2 or 3 years previous, which was I think it was called The Netherlands, the tiny nation that feeds the world. And I read about it, and it focused on it. There were you had all these images of greenhouses, but it never touched on the architecture, which I thought was interesting, because the architecture is central to how the Dutch managed to feed the world. I think I had some of the key, the Netherlands. I mean, if you've seen the Netherlands, it's such a small country, and it's the second largest exporter of food in the world. And the image you see behind here is an area in South Holland near Rotterdam, which the area of greenhouses is 57% larger than the island of Manhattan, to give an idea of scale.
So, before your article, I actually didn't know any of this information, and your article really highlighted that such a small footprint can have such a large effect on the world, or a land mass of such small size.
Yeah, the interest behind this was here. I mean, to reflect back on what I said earlier about London needing an area, I think it was 250 times or 267 or something times the size of London to feed itself or sustain itself. These are some of the landscapes which are created in order to do that. And Rem Koolhaas actually had an exhibition recently at the Guggenheim in New York. I think it was called Countryside, A Future. Okay. And the idea was how our kind of stereotypical view of the countryside as this kind of very natural, untouched landscape is mostly false. I mean, you have some radical examples here. I mean, this landscape we're looking at right here, it's not an urban landscape. It's not really a rural landscape. So kind of, what is it? You wouldn't say it's a suburban landscape. You might say it's an industrial landscape. And increasingly, areas beyond the reach of cities are industrial landscapes. And even if you go into the rural countryside, even in Ireland or the UK, or it's probably the same in South Africa, you see mass swathes of land, which some people might call that rural, but increasingly they're not. There's almost no part of land which hasn't been in some way manipulated or touched by human needs. And yeah, I think that I mean, to go back to your question about how this this idea of agritecture, there is almost a profession in itself which could sustain itself by trying to create architectures which respond to these needs, because quite often in architecture architecture is a human focused profession, and our interest is in how to shape spaces around humans.
True.
I think that's a valiant effort, and it's one that I identify with, but it's only one definition of architecture.
Of course.
I mean, if you visit these if you visit these landscapes in the Netherlands, the level of security surrounding them is almost akin to a government building. These are not landscapes shaped around people. These are landscapes shaped around cold, hard industry and production.
It's like an architecture of systems. It's the
yes,
architecture,
yeah.
but it's different.
Yeah, it is an architecture of systems, and it's what I talked about. This manifests how every single thing manifests as architecture. Architecture is in everything, and it's one. And I mean, even the landscapes we're looking at here. Some challenges for architects about how creating structures which are secure, which are environmentally friendly, which don't rely on such natural light, which don't rely so much on artificial light. And in almost any kind of structure you look at, there is a role for an architect or a design-led discipline in shaping these environments and shaping them in such a way that they're not that we don't allow this kind of out of control system and this kind of linear system, which I think defines much of our processes, where we don't there's almost no attempt at circularity, whether that's circularity of use or circularity of materials or the life of a building beyond its current use. I mean, take these greenhouses. They've been designed for one function and one function only. What are they going to look like in 50 years? What's going to happen to the materials in 50 years if they're no longer needed? And so there's certainly there's rich ground for architects to engage beyond their typical brief, to ask more questions about how the world around us is shaped by our own kind of needs and demands, and where do structures and architecture sit within that.
That actually makes me reflect on the use of the word architecture, because generally, okay, sometimes if people are thinking, when they say it's an architecture of something, they're referring to structure. That's generally what people mean when they sometimes say the word architecture. In this case, if we look at architecture in a broader definition, and we look at it taking into account more than just structure, I think there's plenty ground, fertile ground, if you can say it that way, for architects to expand what can we do with every brief that's presented to us, and broaden our scope of responsibility in addressing these solutions. Perhaps every brief that is presented to us should not be just looked at as an investigation to meet its basic functional, or if you can call it functional, its functional, spatial, volumetric, area requirements, and looking into broader context. And I know architects in general do this, but I think there's other layers we need to add on top of these layers you already are aware of. So just talking about that, or moving towards a question in summary, where do you think the future of architecture is going?
I mean, I'm mostly positive about the future. I mean, I suppose there's several questions within that. There's the future of architecture, the future of the profession. I think that I often look at Liam Young, who's I'm just reading about him before this talk. I interviewed him once for ArchDaily, who has a very ambitious view of architecture connecting more with technology and connecting more with global flows, and that as architects, rather than simply focusing on the property market, the real estate market, and responding to the needs of clients that we traditionally respond to, that we should broaden our client base, broaden our user base, and and within that try to reposition ourselves in the future. I think that there is always going to be a future for a professional to shape landscape, or to shape buildings and structures, and to oversee their design and construction in response to a particular brief by a particular person, whether that is someone looking to build a house, build a school, build a library, or looking to develop large areas of land in a traditional way. I think we spoke a bit the last time about how that may have the advantage of a kind of an obvious and tried and tested income stream for architects, but increasingly it is a block to innovation. If we as architects, if we continue to kind of siphon our role simply into responding to the real estate market and to the increasingly a very speculative property market, we don't leave ourselves room for innovation, and increasingly we're being overtaken by other disciplines who are angling themselves towards innovation and new coming up with new versions of how we live. I mean, the technology sector, the software sectors, tech companies like Apple and Amazon are doing far more to move the needle about how we live in the future than the architecture profession will, because we're almost from the beginning of our education, we're trained with the end goal of being a consultant or playing a role in the speculative property market. I mean, I actually find it quite amusing. So I graduated from my master's 2 years ago, and the kind of, when you graduate from your master's here in Ireland or the UK or Europe, you still can't call yourself an architect. You have to undergo a final diploma, which is almost like a professional practice diploma to show that you're competent to show that you're competent in responding to the needs of a client, etc. And in the university system, there's some room maybe for this idea that architects have a role beyond where most of us are at the moment. By the time you get to those kind of professional diplomas to call yourself an architect, you are just overtly being trained to respond to the needs of a client, to draw up, to oversee the design and construction of a medium-sized building to a client's specifications. And I think that there are a lot of architects who will find that a fulfilling use of time. And I think it is good to have somebody in that position that at least has some understanding of the social, the cultural implications of what is built and how we perceive space and how we perceive cities. But I think that there's so many more opportunities for architects if we can somehow position ourselves beyond that business model of depending on the kind of traditional developer client for us to manifest our ideas in the real world, because it's very difficult to innovate when it's very difficult to use a client's money to test new ideas of design and construction.
That's true.
I mean, there's very, very few clients who are willing to have their money in. It's quite often usually not even their money to be used as almost like a guinea pig or a laboratory experiment in new ways of building and new ways of designing. So we need to seek out other avenues of finance and funding for experimenting, and because one of the in professional practice and in everyday practice, the success rate of an architect is often measured along three things. It's time, cost, and quality.
Right.
That when you have a developer or a client coming to you, quite often those are the three things in their mind. There's cost, quality. How much will this cost? Will it be of good quality that I won't be sued over it? Right. And how long will it? And how long it will take to build it? When you're innovating, it's not even just you can achieve 2 or 3. Quite often at the beginning, you have to let all of those things go. Look at Elon Musk with his rockets. And anytime I see him in the news, it's because one of them exploded. You can't pitch that to you can't pitch it to a developer that yeah, we're going to try and build it this way. It might collapse, but it might cost 10 times the amount we think it does, and it might take 10 times the result. But eventually, this is one step in trying to figure out what new ways we can design and construct, and what new technologies we can take advantage of, and simply what is the role of all of this. So we need to. I mean, it could be the role of the institutions, academic institutions,
exactly.
which
I think
they
you're right.
themselves, particularly in the European and the Irish and the UK markets, are increasingly becoming under pressure to behave like businesses and like companies, to be centered around profit, because so many of them are. I mean, a huge amount of universities in the UK are on the verge of bankruptcy because they get a certain amount of funding from government every year, but ultimately they're being pressured to be a profit-orientated entity. And in the short term, for innovation often isn't really the friend of profit. You have to take huge risk when you're innovating. Again, look at Elon Musk, the amount of money being sunk into SpaceX to achieve more, cheaper, higher quality, reusable rockets. It doesn't happen overnight. So, I mean, I've often wondered why architects don't engage more with, say, angel investing, venture capitalism.
Yes, you mentioned it to me before.
Yeah, and trying to seek out people who are willing to fund innovation and I think it's a shame that this has to go to the private market, because ideally you would have government investment in this kind of thing within government.
Ideal.
But then the kind of political context that we have now is that a government who risks money on I mean, look at I think was it back in 2009 that Barack Obama invested a huge amount of money in Solyndra, which was a solar company, and he gave huge amount of funding to try and develop more effective solar panels, which would cost less, which would be cheaper to build, which would be more environmentally friendly. And I can't remember exactly what happened. I think that they were undercut by another company in Asia, which were able to develop them cheaper. And I think ultimately the venture failed. That was used as a lightning rod for his political opposition, to point out about how, oh, here's this guy in the middle of a recession who's wasted billions of dollars. So increasingly governments are wary over innovation. So I think that so what can architects do about this? I think that part of it, and we talked about this last time, is if we can develop more of a technical understanding and a technical background of what we're of some of the solutions and some of the ways forward, that might be one way of growing confidence in that this is a profession, which is, because quite often the cliche of the architect and even in everyday practice is that they're totally removed from the practicalities, and they're too caught in the hypothetical. That if we can somehow engage more with technical ability and the hard science of technology, that we can aspire more confidence from, say, angel investing, from people who are willing to take a risk, because there are people who are willing to fund startup ventures. I mean, Silicon Valley is built on this, but at the moment I don't see the architects in this whole. I see almost every other profession except architects
That's actually quite true. That you are right there. When it comes to innovation, I'd say we innovate, but not to the same level as can be seen in other fields. And our innovation sometimes does not bear any practical reality to it. So I think this measurability, as you mentioned, that this measure, if we can perhaps demonstrate to some extent this research and these hypotheses which we present, if we can demonstrate it and create some sort of system of measuring, perhaps people might take innovation in architecture more seriously, or at least be more open to it. So you mentioned education, and I think maybe this will be the last point before we go on the break. You were talking about innovation, and in education, you also mentioned earlier on that you actually are doing some work in education or architecture education. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose the work I'm doing for the book at the moment is, I think, coming from a separate angle. It's looking at how we grade architectural education. I mean, I assume it's similar over in South Africa, that quite often students are graded by crits, by presentations, and a group of academics across Ireland and the UK and Europe, we're doing a lot of research into how this isn't a particularly effective way of grading students, about how it's geared towards it's only really geared towards students who have an ability to present, and not it isn't a particularly good vehicle for learning for students. It's just a source of constant anxiety, and it's a forum which often doesn't even suit the academics who are trying to grade it, because they almost the kind of performative nature of grading architecture education has kind of taken over the role and taken over the goal of trying to improve students' understanding. So the book, I mean, I actually have it here. This is very much just in draft at the moment, and this is mirrored, but it's called Rethinking the Crowd. It's actually quite cool. So I'm doing the design and editing for it. It's kind of nice the way it opens.
Oh, it's beautiful.
But yeah, it's a collection of essays about academics around Europe who have tried different models of critiquing students' work, and trying to create a more trying to create an environment more centered around understanding the student's work and trying to improve it, rather than this kind of performative nature, which often overtakes the current method. And ironically, that's not to say that architects shouldn't be good at presenting, because it actually does link exactly into what we just talked about architects instilling confidence in their ideas, and instilling confidence in an understanding of and a solution orientated way of presenting their work to people who aren't architects. But yeah, I think that what we mentioned about education there was really about in the context of innovation, is trying to broaden a student's understanding of what they can do with the skills they acquire at university. And this could be, I mean, I'm not in education, so I can't really dictate what the solution is, but one flaw that I've definitely seen is the trajectory of a student is too heavily influenced by what specific tutor they get in university.
It's quite true.
And quite often the worldview of the tutor translates to the student, and it creates this weird cult-like environment in universities where, say my master's degree had 5 studios with 5 different tutors. All the tutors had different kind of views, and there were 4 of them which were very, very grounded in the idea of architecture as an art form, and my studio was almost a polar opposite. It was looking more at a global context and systems, and trying to broaden the scope of the architect's brief. And almost every year, without fail, the students who were in one group would adopt the stance of their tutor and almost the same opinions of a tutor, and it led to this kind of weird conflict in studios. It's a strange way to run an education system, that the particular views of one person are just constantly being propagated in a kind of a tenfold way every year, because quite often, I mean, it's very difficult to find the perfect academic. You need somebody who
quite true.
Someone who's worked in practice. There's benefits to that. Is it someone who's never worked in practice and who isn't corrupted by maybe the failures of everyday practice? Is it somebody who isn't an architect, is more involved in technology? It's almost like the education system is almost, again, trying to prepare people for a preconceived idea of what an architect needs to do when they leave university. And I don't know what the solution is, but the problem is kind of obvious. It's preparing almost 100% of graduates for a condition that maybe only half of them ever need to be involved in. And I know in the UK context, all it does is create a saturated market where you've too many professionals who are staking their income on a very, very narrow definition of what architecture is. And
that's true. That's extremely true. Sorry, now there, but I must agree with you there that I think this very narrow definition of architecture is the cause of many problems, even when it comes to the earning potential of architects as well. It's because that definition isn't broadened enough, and we are exposed to a lot. In fact, in our studies, the ability to justify and substantiate an argument is something necessary in every field, and an architect can do that quite well. An architect can make the unseen seen. That's
Yeah.
a very powerful force
Something
to
that
reckon with.
something that that architect Liam Youngs, who everyone should look up, he said something to me, which is like, when an architect comes out of university and they go into, say, a bar, they could easily sit down at a bar and have an incredibly engaging, informative discussion with a film director or a biologist or an economist or a politician, or an artist. There's so many there's so many different disciplines that we touch on, and we have such a wealth of knowledge. And even if it's not very, very sophisticated or technical, because that's almost impossible, we nonetheless have an incredibly broad understanding of how the world works. And I just always ask a simple question: is what we do in everyday life, is that a waste of that potential? I think it is. So I think that's the challenge for institutions and for individual architects and graduates, including myself, to try and understand how we can start to you, rather than come out of university or college with the end goal of where we sit within the economy. Try instead to almost invert that and say, here's my set of skills. What am I actually interested in doing when I'm when I'm old and my career is behind me? What will I be proud of looking back? Will I feel as though I've contributed? And the idea of contribution is means something totally different to individual people.
No, I quite like it. I like a lot about what you said about the idea of contribution. In fact, it's something I press quite heavily on, the idea of contribution. When you do reflect, what is it that you feel you've brought to the system of the world? Did you improve it? Did you at least maintain what was good in it? What is it that brings fulfillment to yourself, as well as fulfillment to your society, the surroundings, the structures, the organizations that spin around? So now I thank you very much for joining us on this first half of the particular session. We will continue in, say, about 5 minutes time with questions, because I'm sure, particularly about the crit and the alternatives to a crit, I'm sure the students are hanging on to ask you, how can we get our lecturers to stop annoying us and degrading us in this? But moreover than that, I think students would be just particularly interested in the wealth of perspective you've brought, because your opinions, I wouldn't say are just opinions, but they are very well informed and substantiated, partly because of who you are as a person, partly because of your experiences, and partly because of your education and your working experience. I think you've touched on, you've been in industry, you've been in a different kind of industry in architecture that would be seen at your experience at ArchDaily almost as a digital industry. You have experience in actually in affecting education, at least in the project that you spoke about recently. So you've touched architecture in a lot of avenues: architectural journalism, architectural construction. There's so much you've done, and I think students are probably extremely eager to pick your brain a bit. So we'll give them a few minutes to process their thoughts, and we'll rejoin in about 5 minutes.